The first light of dawn crept across the Whitfield farm, spilling pale gold over the rows of wheat that bowed gently under a lingering breeze. Clara Whitfield stood on the back porch, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, the chill of early morning biting through the thin fabric. She had risen earlier than usual, stirred by something she couldn't quite name, a prickle at the base of her neck that had pulled her from restless dreams. Her eyes wandered across the yard, over the weathered fence line, and toward the stretch of pasture beyond. That was when she saw it. A dog, not one she recognized, sitting perfectly still in the tall grass before the old shack on the edge of their land. It wasn't just the presence of the animal that unsettled her. Dogs in the countryside came and went, strays roaming from one farm to the next in search of scraps. But this one didn't look lost. It didn't look hungry or restless. It sat straight-backed, eyes fixed on the shack's door, as if on duty. Even from this distance, Clara could sense a sharpness in the creature, an alertness that belonged more to a soldier than to a stray. The shack itself was nothing remarkable, at least not anymore. Years ago, it had been used for storing seed and spare tools, but after a storm tore a hole through its roof and rats had made their nests in the floorboards, Clara's father had abandoned it. No one had stepped inside for nearly a decade, save for the occasional farmhand who tossed unwanted lumber against its sagging wall. It was nothing more than a ruin waiting for collapse. And yet the dog sat there like it was guarding a fortress. Clara rubbed her arms, trying to shake the unease that threaded through her. She told herself she was imagining things. Maybe the dog had wandered too far from its owner and found a place to rest. Maybe it had chased a rabbit into the field and paused there out of boredom. Still, she couldn't look away. There was something deliberate in the way the animal positioned itself, nose lifted slightly, ears pricked toward the shack, as though waiting for a sound from within. The rooster crowed behind her, breaking the silence. Clara startled and nearly laughed at her own nerves. Yet when she looked back, the dog hadn't moved, not even to blink. The stillness unnerved her more than any growl could have. Her father's boots scraped against the porch as he stepped out to start the day. He followed her gaze and frowned. "That stray again?" he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. "You've seen it before?" Clara asked. "Yesterday morning, same spot. Wouldn't come near the fields. Wouldn't take food either. Just sat there staring at that old shack." He spat into the dirt, shook his head, and reached for the bucket at his feet. "Best leave it be. Some animals just ain't right in the head." Clara wanted to believe him, to shrug off the gnawing suspicion that the dog's vigil meant something more. But as the sun climbed higher and she busied herself with chores, her eyes kept drifting back toward that lonely shape in the grass. Always watching, always waiting. By mid-morning, when she carried a basket of eggs to the kitchen, she paused at the window. The dog hadn't budged an inch. A hawk swooped low across the field, shadows scattered, and still the animal did not move. It was then that Clara's curiosity sharpened into resolve. She would find out what kept that dog anchored to the shack, and why it seemed less like a wanderer and more like a sentinel. Whatever secret it guarded, she felt certain it was meant to be uncovered, and she, Clara Whitfield, would be the one to uncover it. The Whitfield farmhouse always smelled of earth and wood smoke by evening, the kind of smell that clung to clothes and lingered in the rafters. Supper was simple that night: potatoes boiled with onions, bread browned from the morning's baking, and a slab of salted pork her father had traded for down at Miller's. Clara moved about the kitchen quietly, setting plates on the worn table while her father washed the dust of the day from his hands at the basin. Her brother Thomas slumped into his chair with the weary impatience of someone who'd worked hard but still had energy left to argue. It began the way most of their quarrels did, in low voices that Clara wasn't meant to hear. But the farmhouse walls were thin, and her ears were sharp when her name wasn't on their tongues. "I'm telling you, Pa," Thomas muttered, stabbing at his bread with a knife. "There's been wagons going up that north road all week. Not to our farm, not to Peterson's either. They're headed straight past the ridge, toward that shack." Her father grunted, a sound that was half agreement and half dismissal. "Supplies move all the time. doesn't mean they concern us. These weren't the usual deliveries, Thomas pressed. Canvas, covered loads. Came in before dawn, gone by breakfast. I saw one yesterday, 2 men driving who didn't look like farmhands. Didn't even greet me when I tipped my hat. Clara, standing by the stove, paused with the ladle in her hand. She thought immediately of the dog, how it sat so watchful by that shack, as if it knew what the wagons carried. She wanted to ask, but the way her father's jaw tightened kept her silent for the moment. Strangers come and go, her father said. Men looking for work, passing through. The world don't end because you saw a wagon covered in canvas. Thomas wasn't satisfied. His voice grew sharper, stubborn as the mule he drove in the fields. It isn't just wagons. Folks in town been talking. Said a tall man with a scar across his cheek was seen buying timber, nails, even panes of glass. Paid cash, no haggling. Who in their right mind sinks money into fixing up that shack? It's half rotted already. Clara turned, unable to keep quiet any longer. Maybe the man with the scar is the one the dog belongs to. Both men looked at her, startled she'd spoken. Her father's brows drew down like thunderclouds. Dog? She set the ladle down carefully, her heart thumping. There's been a dog out there, every morning, sitting in the grass before the shack, like it's guarding it. Thomas gave a short laugh, though it lacked humor. Probably some stray. You shouldn't be watching strays, Clara. That's wasted time. It's not just any stray, she insisted, heat rising in her voice. It doesn't move, doesn't wander. It's always there, watching. Like it has a reason. Her father shook his head, reaching for his cup. A girl's imagination can run wild when she's too long at the window. Best let dogs and strangers mind their own business. Clara bit her lip, swallowing the retort that burned in her throat. She knew what she'd seen. The animal wasn't ordinary. Its eyes held a kind of knowledge, the same way people's eyes did when they were keeping a secret. The conversation shifted then, her father muttering about the price of grain. Thomas complaining about the plow team's harness needing repair, but Clara heard none of it. She kept seeing that dog, motionless against the pale boards of the shack, as if every hour it sat there tightened a thread pulling her toward something unknown. Later, when the table was cleared and the house grew quiet, she lay in her bed staring at the low ceiling. Her father's words rang hollow in her ears. Dogs didn't sit guard over ruins for no reason. Strangers didn't pay good money for glass and timber, only to waste it on a shack meant to fall. Something was happening just beyond their fence line, something her family wanted to dismiss. Clara turned on her side and whispered into the dark, a vow meant only for herself. She would find out why. The dog wasn't ordinary. And whatever it watched in that shack, she would uncover it, no matter how deep her father and brother tried to bury their doubts beneath chores and supper talk. The night on the Whitfield farm was the kind that pressed heavy against the windows, so still it seemed the world itself had stopped breathing. The crickets had gone quiet hours ago, leaving only the faint rustle of wheat in the wind and the occasional groan of timber as the house settled into its bones. Clara Whitfield lay beneath her quilt, staring at the ceiling with wide eyes that refused to close. Sleep had abandoned her as surely as the moon had abandoned the sky. She turned, restless, and pulled the curtain aside. The fields spread out like a dark sea, the ridges of wheat swaying in shadow. Beyond the fence, the shack crouched against the earth, a crooked silhouette she had known her entire life. For years it had stood there, hollow and useless, no more threatening than an old scarecrow. But tonight, something made her breath catch. A faint flicker glowed from within the cracks of its boarded windows. Clara pushed herself up, heart pounding. She blinked hard, telling herself it was a trick of her eyes, maybe a reflection of starlight, though the sky was too clouded for stars. The flicker came again, steady this time, unmistakable, the glow of lamplight. Someone was inside the shack. Her first thought was of her father's words at supper, his dismissal of her worries. A girl's imagination, he'd said. Yet here it was, proof dancing in the dark. She leaned closer to the window, nose nearly pressed against the glass. And then she saw it, the dog. It was exactly where it had been that morning, sitting in the tall grass before the shack door. No shifting of paws, no lazy circling the way dogs usually did when tired. It sat rigid, ears pointed forward, gaze fixed on the door, a sentry in the night. The lamplight inside grew brighter, casting longer beams through the gaps in the wood. Clara squinted, straining to see more. Shadows moved across the walls, someone pacing, pausing, bending over as though examining something. She imagined the scrape of tools, the whisper of paper, though she could hear nothing from her distance. The shack, once dead, now pulsed with secret life. The dog lifted its head slightly, reacting to something within. But it never barked, never whimpered. It seemed to understand what happened inside and guarded it with quiet devotion. Clara shivered. She had never seen such discipline in an animal. Dogs barked at intruders, wagged their tails at kindness, whimpered when lonely. But this creature held itself like it knew its purpose. Clara pressed her hand to the cool glass. Questions tumbled through her mind, sharp and insistent. Who had lit the lamp? What could be worth all this secrecy? And why a dog instead of men to guard the door? Her breath fogged the pain as she leaned closer. For one instant she thought the shadow inside turned toward her, as if whoever was within had sensed her watching. She jerked back from the window, heart hammering, ears straining for the sound of footsteps across the yard, but none came. Only the light shifting, then dimming again, until it was nothing more than a thin glow threading through the cracks. Clara lay back against her pillow, but her body was taut as wire. The dog's silhouette remained in her mind long after she turned from the window, its stillness, its certainty, the way it seemed to wait for someone who never arrived. Sleep was impossible now. For the first time in her life, the abandoned shack no longer felt like a forgotten ruin. It felt like a secret beating heart, pulsing just beyond her reach, and the dog was its watchful guardian. By the time the lamplight winked out and darkness reclaimed the shack, Clara knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever mystery lay within, it was not going to reveal itself to the men of her family. It was waiting for her, and she would not turn away. The air in town carried the smells of horse sweat and fresh sawdust, mixed with the yeasty sweetness that drifted from Miller's bakery. Clara Whitfield walked with her basket against her hip, her bonnet tied snug beneath her chin, listening more than she spoke as she made her errands. It was her way, and people rarely noticed how keenly she paid attention when they thought she was just another farmer's daughter collecting flour and soap. That morning the talk was livelier than usual, voices lowered but urgent, eyes darting toward the street as if the subject of their whispers might appear at any moment. "I swear he paid with gold," Mrs. Henderson muttered to another woman near the counter of Miller's general store. "Not coin like ours, but something heavier. Didn't blink when the clerk asked near twice the price." "Heard the same," the other replied, shifting a sack of sugar. "And yet the man doesn't buy much. Not food, not tools, nothing regular folk need. Comes into town, drops money, and disappears again." Clara leaned a little closer, pretending to study the rows of jars along the shelf. She didn't need to ask who they meant. She had caught sight of him once before, a tall man with dark hair streaked by the sun, his coat too fine for the dirt roads of their valley. His presence had stirred the same unease in her then as the dog that guarded the shack. "Name's Elias Brandt," said Mr. Wheeler, the postmaster, who joined in with the kind of relish only men who kept the town's secrets enjoyed. "Claimed he came from Missouri, but I've not seen a letter arrive for him, nor one sent. A man without ties, that's what unsettles me." Mrs. Henderson clucked her tongue. "A man without ties can't be trusted. Folks say he's harmless, just another wanderer, but wanderers don't walk around with that kind of money. And harmless men don't look at you like they're measuring the weight of your soul." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft sneaking through the store's doorframe. She remembered the way she had once glimpsed him, walking past the shack at the edge of their land. He hadn't glanced at the fields or at the broken fence. His eyes had lingered on the shack itself, quick but knowing, like a man passing by something he already owned. She had told herself then it meant nothing. Now, listening to the gossip swirl, she wasn't so sure. When she stepped back onto the boardwalk, the sun struck her face, but it didn't chase away the unease that clung to her. Around her, the town hummed with ordinary life, children darting between wagons, a blacksmith hammering sparks into the air, traders shouting prices from their stalls. Yet every conversation she passed seemed to circle back to Elias Brandt. Some thought he was running from the law. Others whispered of old debts and hidden treasure. A few said he was simply cursed, carrying misfortune like dust on his boots. Clara kept her eyes on the road as she walked toward home, but her mind remained fixed on the image of him. The tall frame, the deliberate stride, the faint scar across his cheek she hadn't noticed until now, in memory. She imagined him stepping into the shack, the lamplight she had seen spilling against his coat, the dog rising to greet him like a loyal soldier. The weight of the basket grew heavier against her hip, though she knew it wasn't the bread and flour making her arms ache. It was the knowledge that the dog, the shack, and Elias Brandt were threads in the same web. And if the whispers in town were true that he carried wealth without a source, that he lived without ties, then whatever secret he kept inside that shack might be far more dangerous than she had dared to imagine. As she left the town behind and the fields opened before her, Clara lifted her eyes to the distant line of trees. The shack sat hidden beyond, crouched against the land like it had been waiting for her family to forget it. But she hadn't forgotten, and now, neither had the town. Elias Brandt's shadow stretched farther than his footsteps, and Clara knew it had already crossed her threshold. The afternoon sun pressed down hard, flattening the fields into sheets of gold and making the air shimmer along the fence line. Clara had finished her chores early, her father off mending a neighbor's plow, her brother busy in the far pasture. The moment of solitude was rare, and it carried with it a pull she had been resisting for days. She set her basket aside and walked toward the ridge where the shack crouched, half hidden by the tall grass. Each step seemed louder than the last, the crunch of dry stalks under her shoes sounding like cracks of thunder in the stillness. The closer she came, the more the shack seemed less like a ruin, and more like something alive, its boards breathing with secrets. Her palms grew damp, yet her curiosity pressed her forward. She told herself she only wanted a better look, that standing so close would prove there was nothing unusual at all. But in her heart she knew that wasn't true. The dog appeared before she even realized it had moved. One moment the doorway was empty, and the next the shaggy creature was there, rising from the grass, as if it had been waiting for her approach all along. Its fur was rough and unkempt, streaked with dust, its frame broad but not heavy, eyes the color of wet soil fixed on her, unblinking, assessing. Clara froze where she stood, her breath caught between her teeth. It didn't growl. That unsettled her more than if it had. Instead, the dog held its ground in silence, tail neither wagging nor tucked, body as still as stone. She felt as though she were standing before a sentry posted at a gate, one that had the authority to decide who entered and who did not. Clara swallowed and forced herself to take another step. Her skirt brushed the grass, the sound whisper thin compared to the pounding of her heart. The dog's ears flicked, but it didn't move. She raised her eyes to the door, trying to steady her nerves by focusing on the wood rather than the creature that stood between her and it. The door was worse up close. The boards had warped from years of rain, the nails rusted to a dull orange, but what caught her attention were the markings cut into the grain. At first she thought them the idle whittlings of boys' random lines, crude initials. Yet the longer she studied them, the clearer they became. Patterns, interlocking shapes, circles within triangles, a sequence of slashes repeating at intervals. Not the language of mischief, but something deliberate, etched with care. Her fingertips itched to trace them, to feel the grooves beneath her hand. But the dog shifted then, only slightly, and the warning was clear. Its silence carried weight, as if it were saying, "This far, no farther." Clara's breath came uneven now. She took a half step back, eyes darting from the markings to the animal. Its gaze had not wavered once, and she realized with a shiver that it had allowed her this close on purpose. Allowed her to see the door, the carvings, the evidence that what she suspected was true. Someone was using this shack, and not for any ordinary purpose. A cloud drifted across the sun, dimming the light, and in the shadowed stillness Clara thought she heard something from inside. A scrape, faint but unmistakable, like wood dragged across wood. She looked quickly at the dog, expecting it to react, but it only blinked, as calm as ever. It already knew. It had known she would hear. The urge to run was strong, but her feet rooted her in place. She could not unsee the marks, nor forget the quiet permission in the dog's watchful stare. She backed away slowly, never turning her back until the shack was once more a blur against the field. Only when the farmhouse came into view did Clara realize her hands were trembling. The markings on the door burned in her mind, etched as deeply as if she had carved them herself. Whatever they meant, they were not the idle work of a wanderer. They were a message or a warning, and she had been allowed just close enough to know it. The sun had dipped low, stretching the shadows of the cottonwoods across the road by the time Clara reached Miller's general store. She hadn't meant to linger in town that long, but her errands had slowed with every conversation that turned, inevitably, toward Elias Brandt and the strange things folks swore they'd seen near the North Ridge. She kept her own suspicions folded tight inside, like a letter never sent. By the time she stepped out onto the boardwalk with her sack of flour, the air was already cooling, the sky brushed with that lavender hue that warned night was near. Boone Carter was waiting at the hitching post, hat tilted back, one boot resting on the rail. His easy grin came quick when he saw her, but it didn't reach his eyes. He'd grown since last summer, taller, broader in the shoulders, though he still carried himself with that restless eagerness of a man trying to prove he was worth more than odd jobs and quick carpentry repairs. "Clara," he greeted, straightening. "You walking home alone this late?" "I'm not far," she said, adjusting the sack against her hip. "Besides, I'm not helpless." He chuckled softly, though his gaze lingered a moment too long, as though measuring the truth of her words. After a pause, he asked, "That shack out by your land, you been near it lately?" Her pulse quickened. She masked it with a steady tone. "Why do you ask?" "Because folks are saying things," he replied, lowering his voice. "I heard tell of light burning inside at hours no honest man keeps. Heard of wagons carrying timber and iron that don't show up on any accounts. And more than one has seen you looking that way." Clara shifted, her jaw tight. "And what if I have?" Boone scratched at his jaw, glancing toward the dusty street. "If it were me, I'd stay clear. But since I know you better than that, I'll say this, let me take a look. I know how to read wood, Clara. Markings, cuts, joinery. I could tell you what's being built in there, maybe even who's building it. You'd have your answers without the risk." The offer sat heavy between them. She imagined him stepping toward the shack, the dog rising from the grass, the silence breaking into something dangerous. The thought clenched her stomach, not because she doubted Boone's skill, but because she knew in her bones the shack wasn't waiting for him. It was waiting for her. "No," she said finally, firm enough that even she was surprised. "I'll manage on my own." Boone studied her, concern etched clear across his face. "Clara, this isn't just curiosity anymore. There's talk Elias Brandt isn't who he says he is. Some whisper he's harmless, others say he's dangerous. If he's tied to that shack, then walking into it alone is asking for trouble." Her grip tightened on the flour sack. "Then let trouble come. I've seen the dog. It didn't stop me. If there are answers to be found, I'll find them myself." For a long moment, only the creak of the boardwalk filled the silence. Then Boone sighed, deep and weary. "You're braver than most men I know. But bravery don't keep you safe, Clara. Sometimes it just makes you first in line for the hurt." Uh. She turned from him then, unwilling to let his words take root. Yet as she made her way down the road toward the fading light of her family's farm, they clung to her all the same. Bravery, first in line for the hurt. She told herself she had no choice, that the shack had chosen her. Still, Boone's warning burrowed deep, leaving her with the uneasy question she could not shake. Perhaps she was in over her head. And perhaps the next step she took toward the shack would be the one that cost her everything. The late afternoon light slanted across the fields, painting the wheat in strokes of amber and shadow. Clara moved carefully, each step measured as though the very earth might betray her. She had chosen her moment with care. Her father and Thomas were down by the creek mending the broken fence post, and no one would miss her for at least an hour. Her heart thudded a nervous rhythm in her chest as she neared the shack, the same structure that had grown less abandoned with each passing day. The dog was there, as always. It rose from the grass when she came into sight, its head lifting, eyes locking onto her with an uncanny steadiness. Clara slowed, not daring to approach directly. She shifted to the side, circling slowly, pretending to examine the field as though she had no interest at all in the building. But the dog followed her with its gaze, tracking every subtle movement. She came upon a gap in the boards near the back corner, where time and weather had pulled the wood apart just enough to allow a narrow view inside. Clara's breath caught as she pressed her face to the crack. The interior was nothing like she remembered from childhood, when the shack had been little more than broken tools and piles of rotted seed. Now it was ordered, deliberate. Along one wall, tools gleamed, their handles polished, their blades sharpened. They were hung in neat rows by size, the kind of precision her father never bothered with, the kind that spoke of a craftsman who took pride in arrangement as much as in use. A workbench stretched along another wall, its surface covered with papers held down by smooth stones. She could make out the edges of drawings, lines, arcs, measurements, though not enough to see their purpose. Every corner of the place radiated intent. But what drew her gaze most, what sent a shiver crawling up her spine, was the object in the center of the room. A massive wooden crate, nearly the length of a man and taller than her waist, bound tightly with chains that gleamed dull in the slanting lamplight. Heavy padlocks sealed the iron links in place. It was not storage, it was confinement. Whatever lay inside was not meant to be touched, not meant to be opened without effort and design. Clara pressed closer to the crack, straining to see more. The crate's surface was carved with faint markings, not unlike the ones she had found on the door. Triangles, slashes, curved lines, intersecting in ways she could not decipher. They seemed less like decoration, and more like a language, silent words etched into wood. Her pulse hammered. Who would go to such lengths? To chain a crate? To mark it like a warning? The question burned hotter than fear itself. A low sound broke her thoughts, a shift in the grass behind her. Clara turned slowly. The dog had moved. It stood closer now, only a few paces away, its body angled between her and the shack. No growl came from its throat, no snap of teeth. Just those eyes, steady and knowing, fixed on her like a teacher catching a child with stolen ink on her fingers. Clara's breath trembled as she stepped back. The dog mirrored the movement with a small adjustment of its paws, not advancing, not retreating, just reminding her it was there, that she had been allowed this much and no more. She whispered to herself, though the words barely left her lips, "What's inside?" The dog blinked once, slow, as though it had heard her, understood her, and refused to answer. Clara retreated further, the boards of the shack vanishing from view as the tall grass swallowed her again. Only when the structure was a dark smudge behind her did she dare to release the breath she had been holding. The image of the crate burned in her mind, the gleam of the chains, the symbols carved deep into the wood. Whatever secret the shack held, it was no longer something she could dismiss as harmless oddity. Something lived or lingered inside that crate, and it was being guarded by chains, by symbols, and by a silent dog who knew more than it ever let on. The moon was little more than a pale sliver in the sky when Clara slipped from the farmhouse. She had waited until her father's snores settled into their familiar rhythm and Thomas's breathing grew slow and heavy in the loft. Her shawl hung loose over her shoulders, more for comfort than warmth, and she kept to the shadowed side of the yard as she crossed into the fields. Every step seemed to echo louder than it should, her shoes brushing against dry grass with a whisper that made her wince. Yet, nothing stirred, not even the night birds. It was as though the whole valley held its breath. Her eyes fixed on the shack. Even in the dark, it drew her like a lantern in fog. The boards glowed faintly where lamplight leaked through cracks, lines of gold against the black timbers. She had not imagined it before. Someone was in there, and the dog that never left its post was standing guard as always. Clara paused at the fence, fingers tightening around the weathered rail. Her heart thudded, urging her to turn back. She could tell herself she had come far enough, that seeing the light again was proof enough of mystery. But her curiosity pressed harder, whispering that she would never forgive herself if she didn't step closer, if she didn't hear with her own ears what business required such secrecy. She climbed the fence and crept forward, crouching low until the grass brushed her skirts. The shack loomed larger with every cautious step. She expected the dog to bark, to block her path, but instead it only turned its head as she neared, eyes catching the moonlight in an otherworldly glint. For a long moment, it studied her, silent as a sentinel. Then, astonishingly, it shifted aside, padding 2 steps away from the doorway, as if to make space for her. Clara froze, her breath snagging in her chest. It was permission. She couldn't think of it any other way. With trembling resolve, she edged closer until the wooden planks were only a few feet from her. The lamplight was clearer now, flickering steady, shadows moving across the seams of the boards. She leaned near a gap, pressing her cheek close to the rough wood. A voice came from within, low, steady, carrying the weight of a man who knew what he was doing. "Tomorrow," it said. "Tomorrow, it will be ready." Clara's blood ran cold. The words struck her like a hand across the face, sharp with meaning she could not reach. Ready for what? The scrape of something heavy followed the drag of iron over wood, the dull clink of chain. She pictured the locked crate at the center of the room, imagined it shifting under unseen hands. The man spoke again, softer this time, as though addressing another presence, but she heard no reply. Whether he was speaking to himself or to someone she could not see, she could not tell. Her fingers dug into the cracks of the wall. Every instinct screamed for her to run, yet she stayed, straining to catch more. "By dawn," the voice continued, "no one will question it. By dusk it will be finished." The lamp hissed as the wick was trimmed, and shadows stretched longer. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. Finished. The word curled through her mind like smoke. She dared a glance toward the dog. It stood only a few feet away, its profile calm, ears forward. Again it did not warn him of her presence, did not drive her away. Instead, it seemed to hold its vigil for both of them, as though it understood she needed to hear. Clara leaned back at last, pressing a hand to her mouth to quiet her ragged breathing. The questions swarmed too fast to catch what was inside the crate, what was meant to be ready by tomorrow, why the dog let her listen when it had no reason to. She slipped back through the grass, her eyes never leaving the shack until distance swallowed the lamplight. Only then did she dare to run, the words echoing in her skull with every step. Tomorrow, it will be ready. The night smelled of damp earth and smoke, the kind of night that pressed close around the skin and made every sound travel further than it should. Clara crouched in the grass, heart pounding, as the lamplight inside the shack flickered and grew stronger. She had followed her instincts, slipping away once more when the farm lay still and silent, driven by the words she had heard the night before. Tomorrow it will be ready. Tonight was tomorrow, and something told her the promise was about to be fulfilled. Through the crack in the board she waited, breath shallow, the rough wood biting against her cheek. The lamplight inside shifted, shadows of a man moving deliberately, purposefully. Then came the scrape of iron, the groan of wood resisting, the sound of chains unfastened, lock pins sliding free. Clara knew instantly what it was: the crate. Her hands trembled against the grass, but she forced herself to stay still. The air inside the shack seemed to hum with anticipation, the kind that comes before lightning strikes. She saw him now, the tall man, alias Brant, though she had no doubt by then that wasn't his true name. He knelt at the crate, his face half illuminated by the lamplight, his scar catching the glow like a slash of iron. Slowly, deliberately, he worked at the locks. The chains slithered to the floor, heavy and final. Then, with a long breath, he pried the lid open. The hinges shrieked faintly as the top shifted, and Clara pressed closer, her pulse thundering. She had expected metal, weapons, maybe even stolen treasure. But what she glimpsed in the lamplight made her blood run cold. Not gold, not guns, not anything so simple. Inside lay stacks of parchment bound into thick ledgers, their spines stamped with seals she did not recognize but which glinted with authority. Each was carefully wrapped in oiled cloth to keep them dry, protected as though they were worth more than coin. And beside them, nestled in straw as carefully as eggs in a basket, were bottles, dozens of them, glass catching the lamplight in eerie colors. Some were filled with powders, others with liquids that shimmered faintly, unnatural in their hues. She could not name what they were, but even at her distance she felt the danger in them, like the warning heat before fire consumes. Brant lifted one ledger and flipped it open. Rows upon rows of names, numbers, symbols, records. His voice, low and fervent, carried clearly in the silence. When this reaches them, the town won't have a choice. They'll bend, or they'll break. Clara's breath hitched. It wasn't treasure he had hidden here, it was power. Plans, formulas, records of something that could change everything about their quiet valley. She didn't understand the details. Not yet, but she knew enough to feel the weight of it. The lid creaked wider, the lamplight spilling across more of the contents. She saw another bundle beneath the ledgers. Maps, carefully inked, with lines that cut across the very ridges and streams she had known since childhood. The town was marked, circled. Other marks spread outward like a spider's web, towns she recognized from stories of trade and travel. Her mouth went dry. This wasn't a man building shelter. This was a man building control. The dog shifted then, just outside the doorway, its body half turned toward Clara, as if it knew what she had seen. Its eyes met hers, steady, unblinking, but this time she felt no permission in them, only warning. Inside, Brant's laughter was soft but certain. He closed the ledger and set it back into the crate, lowering the lid with a reverence that chilled her. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "the first step begins." Clara slipped back from the wall, her knees weak beneath her. She didn't know what powders filled those bottles, what schemes filled those ledgers, but she knew they were not meant for good. Whatever alias Brant planned, it was not survival, it was dominion. And if he succeeded, her town's future would be bound in chains heavier than the ones that had sealed the crate. She ran through the dark fields, breath ragged, the echo of his words chasing her like a shadow she could not outrun. Clara lay awake long after slipping back into her bed, her body still trembling from what she had seen. The memory of the crate burned behind her eyes, the ledgers, the bottles filled with strange powders and liquids, the maps with their web of lines reaching outward from her town as though Elias Brant meant to ensnare it in something vast and terrible. She turned over again and again, but no amount of pulling the quilt tight could quiet the questions. Should she tell her father? Could she? He would dismiss her, the way he always did when she spoke of the shack or the dog. Thomas would laugh at her imagination, or worse, march out there with a hot temper and get himself killed. By morning, her decision still hadn't settled. The farm's routine carried on as if the world hadn't shifted in the night. She gathered eggs, washed the dishes, listened to her father grumble about the rising cost of grain. But she couldn't shake the sound of Brant's voice, low and deliberate. Tomorrow, the first step begins. When the sun dipped again toward late afternoon, Clara found herself walking back to the ridge. She told herself it was only to think, but her feet knew better. The shack loomed ahead, weathered boards glowing faint in the slant of light, and there he was, the dog, waiting, just as before. It lifted its head when she appeared, dark eyes locking with hers. Clara stopped at the edge of the grass. Her breath came uneven, and she realized how strange it was that she no longer feared the animal. It had not barked, had not chased her off. It simply watched, unyielding, as though guarding more than wood and chains. In its gaze she felt a question, one she had not wanted to admit even to herself. What will you do now? The weight of her choice pressed hard against her chest. If she spoke, she risked panic in the town. People would act rashly. Some might rally against Brant without knowing what danger truly lay in those bottles, those ledgers. If she stayed silent, she became complicit in whatever scheme he wove. The dog's eyes did not shift, did not blink, as though urging her to see the truth. She was part of this now, whether she willed it or not. She closed her eyes, recalling the markings carved into the shack door. The strange language that seemed less like art and more like warning. She remembered the scrape of chains, the careful way Brant had handled those documents. Nothing about his work was reckless. It was planned, measured, and it was close to ready. A breeze stirred the tall grass, brushing against her skirts. She stepped forward, only one pace, enough to feel the dog's steady presence just yards away. It tilted its head, as if acknowledging her resolve. Clara whispered into the dusk, voice trembling but firm. I can't stay quiet. The dog blinked once, slowly, then settled back onto its haunches, a sentinel at rest. She couldn't explain why, but in that gesture she felt its approval, or at least its recognition. She turned back toward the farm, the glow of their lanterns just beginning to kindle in the windows. Her father would dismiss her, perhaps. Thomas might mock her, the town might not believe. But silence was no longer possible. As she crossed the fence and the earth softened under her boots, Clara felt the weight of her choice settle into her bones. Whatever lay ahead, panic, confrontation, danger, it was hers to face. The dog would remain by the shack, guarding its secret, but the burden of warning the living, breathing souls of her town now belonged to her alone. The sky deepened to violet as she walked, and the first stars flickered overhead. The world looked unchanged, but Clara knew better. She had crossed a line she could never step back over. The secret was no longer his alone. It was hers, and she would not let it stay hidden.